Welcome into another preseason preview series edition. I'm here with my partner, Mike Bainbridge. Mike, we're talking Pac-12 today. We've run through a number of conferences. We're coming down the stretch now. We're just about halfway through. Any thoughts before we jump into the teams from the Pac-12 with maybe any recent news that's kind of come our way?
Well, I was just going to say it's a pretty timely podcast here with the Pac-12, just with the recent news that's come out with USC and UCLA. So let's dive right into it.
Yeah, I think there'll be some questions coming that way when we get there. But like we usually do, we're going to go ahead and kind of start with some of the bottom feeders of the conference first. And so we're going to get right into it, jump in with the Arizona Wildcats. Mike, what any questions there? Going into preseason camp, I mean, it's Arizona, right? So I don't know how much we're going to be looking that way for fantasy production. Anything in particular you're keeping your eyes on?
Yeah, it's that roster is kind of a wasteland right now with just the old coaching staff. Obviously, they didn't do a good job because they're no longer there. Not a ton of question marks here. I don't think I've drafted anybody from Arizona this year in any drafts previously. I think if somebody does emerge, it'll probably be in the backfield. I assume they'll probably run the ball at least to start. While they're trying to implement a new system with new quarterbacks. So it's a talented group back there. We just don't know at this point who that running back one will be. And I think at this point it'll probably be a committee, but Drake Anderson and Northwestern transfers in the mix. They got a couple younger guys, Jalen John, Michael Wiley, Darius Smith, all guys that have contributed a bit in the past and have seen playing time. And then the true freshman, Stevie Rocker Jr., who made a big impression during the spring. So, it may not matter who comes out as a starter because all five guys might see playing time this year, but I'm kind of interested to see who comes out of that group.
Yeah, I'm with you. Running back would be nice to know. I think that might end up being the most, well, other than receiver, the most stable position there. For me, I've got my eyes on the quarterback spot too, right? You've got Jordan McLeod coming over from South Florida. You have Gunnar Cruz that came over from Washington State. Two guys that weren't recruited into the program initially, transferred in. I would think that one or two of those guys would be the favorites to win that job, but we just don't know. But let's be honest, if there's going to be any production that comes from running back and any production that comes from receiver on this roster, they've got to get that quarterback spot settled first. And so, if it ends up being a rotation there, it could wind up being a long season for the Wildcats. So more so probably you and I have our finger on the pulse of them moving forward through the season, as opposed to really rostering or advising folks to roster any guys in the preseason over there. What about UCLA Bruins, Mike? We're going to go over to UCLA. There's a lot to talk about over with the Bruins, or, a couple of spots I feel a couple of ways we can go with this. What are you looking for out of preseason for the Bruins?
Yeah, I was initially going to go with the running back spot, but then news came out yesterday that Dorian Thompson-Robinson was quote unquote unavailable during practice. There was no specific reasoning given by Chip Kelly. I was looking into it, and the backup quarterback, whose name's escaping me, he was also unavailable for practice. Is
that Chase Griffin?
No, Parker McQuarrie, I believe. So maybe the third stringer, but that just kind of, just what we've dealt with over the last year kind of makes you think like, two guys in the quarterback room are out of practice. Is this possibly, contact tracing related? But then, it's just kind of researching, and then everybody that went to Pac-12 media days was vaccinated, and Dorian Thompson-Robinson, so he went there. So he is vaccinated. So as far, who knows at this point why he was unavailable, but he missed 2 games last year due to COVID. So, is this going to be another issue this season? Remains to be seen. But then, and you might touch on this too, the backfield with who comes out as running back one, I think will be a definite question that we're looking for this.
Yeah. I think in regards to DTR, Mike, he's probably the highest rated quarterback that I have ranked that I'm most likely to stay away from in drafts this year. I feel that his upside and ceiling in games are, it's tremendous, particularly running Chip Kelly's offense. But you mentioned it. You hit the nail on the head. He's missed a couple of games last year. I feel like and his backup came in and played really well. That scares me off of DTR just a little bit. If I'm in a best ball format, I'd probably take both guys. And in that regard, I wouldn't shy away, but any redraft traditional leagues, it makes me a little nervous. Now, the running back spot for me is really where more of my attention is going to focus on, because who doesn't want RB1 in Chip Kelly's offense, right? And so I think right now my favorite to win the job is going to be Britton Brown. I know, they've got Zach Charbonnet, the Michigan transfer, that's in there as well. He's got great size as well. And, could he win that job? Absolutely, he could. I think Britton Brown will get first shot at that. And you and I both know, historically, that usually when Kelly identifies that running back one and that running back one stays healthy, he's going to feed him over 200 carries. And so, I've done some reading around. I see some stuff on Twitter, some questions about whether or not Britton Brown's going too early in drafts. I don't think if Britton Brown is a running back one, I don't know if there's such thing as going up and getting him too early. The question is that are those comments just based solely on the fact that we're not 100% sure that he's going to be the running back? But in college fantasy football, you've got to put a stake in the ground somewhere. And Mike's right now, I'm going with Britton Brown. So I may be one of the guys that tend to reach a little earlier on him to make sure that I get him as opposed to waiting.
Yeah, I think you just have to handcuff, to be honest, because, we've seen back at his time at Duke where Britton Brown has had injury issues in the past. Now, it doesn't mean that's going to happen necessarily this year, but we posted it on the Discord yesterday. We're seeing indications from some of the writers for UCLA that this isn't a running back one and then a running back two. This is a running back 1A and running back 1B. So, maybe Britton Brown stays healthy and is a 200 plus carry back, but you're also seeing indications that Charbonnet is going to be heavily involved in this offense. So I think it's best to just handcuff them both, because you know what, this UCLA offense, they return 4 starters along the offensive line. They averaged as a team over 5 yards a carry last year. So regardless of who's in that backfield, they're going to be effective this year running the football.
Well, let's head over to the Bears, Cal Berkeley. What are the questions going into preseason camp for you with them?
I want to see how Chase Garbers looks in year 2 of this Bill Musgrave offense. There's always a transition period when you're installing a new offensive system. And Chase Garbers really, he didn't play that well last year. But then you kind of just look a little bit closer at the numbers, and in 3 of the 4 games, he topped 20 fantasy points. And in 3 of those 4 games, he topped double-digit carries as a runner. So, I mean, those are the types of things that you look for as in a college fantasy quarterback, if they're given it, production on the ground as well as through the air. So, and nobody's been targeting him in our best ball drafts. So this is a guy that you can get with your last round pick. So why not take a shot as him as your, QB4, QB5?
I feel the same way at the running back spot, Mike, with Christopher Brown Jr. I know there's Marcel Dancy there. There's Damian Moore there. I believe Brown was a little dinged up last year, but he's shown that he can carry a heavy workload in that offense. So I'm not saying that's going to happen this year, but I think based on the potential and based on his history, if they decide that they want to run a back, particularly if they get up late or if they want to grind it out, I think Christopher Brown Jr. may be overlooked. That's what I love about doing these shows for the conferences and really getting a hit on every team. I feel like I get a chance to mention the guys that I feel are flying under the radar a little bit a couple of years ago, Christopher Brown was probably ranked in our top 30, I think, going into the season at one point. That's how good he looked for Cal. He's gotten a little dinged up last year, and we would say that he's shown regression, but I don't think health has been on his side. I'm curious to see if he comes in healthy this year, if he can carry the load in that offense, and maybe he gets north of 175 carries. And if so, then I think he's undervalued in fantasy drafts, because a lot of the drafts that you and I are participating in, Chris Brown's going very late, if being drafted at all. I know I picked him up in a couple of best ball drafts, but I've also stayed away from him, and I think he went undrafted in some of those too.
Yeah, I like Christopher Brown Jr. I think he's a bigger back, and he can catch the ball in the backfield. I keep seeing indications that they're going to use Damian Moore and Marcel Dancy in that backfield. So, if he hits 175 carries, then yeah, you got a steal in the last round of your drafts. But that's just kind of a room that I'm staying away from, and we'll monitor the waivers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm taking him late at that particular point, right? There's nothing but upside, because I'm not losing any value. So absolutely. Let's head up north to Oregon State, Mike. Beavers, obviously, Jamar Jefferson has moved on. That was the most valuable fantasy piece in that offense. What are we looking for going into 2021?
I want to know how many running backs will be involved in their committee, because every indication that we've gotten thus far is that it's going to be a committee. How many guys are involved in that committee? That's what I want to figure out. We know Deshaun Fenwick's going to be involved, and we know BJ Baylor is going to be involved. Is Isaiah Newell going to be involved? Is the true freshman Demir Collins going to be involved? That's obviously going to have a big impact as to how Deshaun Fenwick, our projected running back one, how his fantasy production output ends up this year. So we've seen in the past, obviously, with Jamar Jefferson, Artavis Pierce, that we want to target running backs in this passing game. The running back one averages 26 catches per season. So they're definite value in PPR formats as well. So just how many guys are going to be involved in that backfield?
I'm with you, Mike. A year ago, we were just worried about whether or not BJ Baylor was going to take a little bit of value away from Jamar Jefferson. Obviously, that didn't happen as long as Jefferson was healthy. But here we are a year later, and BJ Baylor is not even the presumed starter. They're bringing in Fenwick from South Carolina. And I know there's a lot of folks that believe that Fenwick can nail down that starting job, but I'm with you. I want to see things unfold in preseason camp. That running back one has been tremendous fantasy value, in the recent past. And we're just, I'm curious to see if, like you mentioned, is it going to be more of a committee, or are they going to eventually get to the point where they feel more confident in one back than the other? And much like I've mentioned on a bunch of teams this year, that's something we can be watching in preseason camp, but I have a feeling we'll be monitoring that 2 to 4 weeks into the new season, Mike. Real quick, let's hop over to Colorado. Jarek Broussard, big year last year, high volume and carries this year. You and I have spoken about this. We may be feeling, a little differently on this one. What are your questions going into 2021 with the Buffaloes?
What's the workload going to be like for Jarek Broussard? You see, the offensive coordinator mentioning that they want to get more guys involved this year. Ashad Clayton, talented redshirt freshman. Alex Fontenot is back and healthy. So are they going to distribute carries between the three? Because that's what made Jarek Broussard so effective last year, is that he was, top 5 in the nation in carries per game last year at 26. So how much will Colorado distribute the rushing load amongst those three? We don't know to this point, and we don't have a strong history of what this offensive coordinator, this offensive staff likes to do from a distribution of carry standpoint. So I'm really curious to see how they share the backfield with Broussard and the rest of them.
I'm with you. I feel like this is going to be a true litmus test of what I feel happens sometimes in the off season. All the indications from early spring. Look, Jarek Broussard Broussard played with a brace on his knee last year. He was recovered from 2 injuries that he's had, I believe, on the same knee early on in his career. He had a breakout year last year. He's lost a knee brace. He was said to look more quicker and faster in spring camp. And yet on the flip side of that, we get the news that maybe they want to, distribute carries a little bit more and use more of a committee approach, right? The question for me is, Jared Broussard was so solid last year. It's hard for me to think that they wouldn't want to utilize what arguably looked like their best player on the field last year. And so I think it becomes a matter of need. And sometimes I think in these situations, when we read the news clippings, for as much as you and I read them, the players read them too. And nowadays, these coaches have to make sure that these guys aren't transferring out of there. They're already lost Jaron Mangum last year to a transfer. And sometimes I think some of this is coach speak to make sure that they don't lose depth along the, players along the depth chart. So you're right, man. This is a real interesting case of Jared Broussard. Do they give him a heavy load? Do they work in other guys? And how much do they work them in? Because it's hard for me to believe, for as productive as Broussard was last year, that they're not going to find a way to get him as many touches as they can this year. And so this is something that we'll probably revisit halfway through the year or the end of the year. But I feel like maybe Broussard could have another big year, and maybe it's a little bit of coach speak to keep those players around. We'll see. Only time will tell, but definitely something you and I are keeping our eyes on going into preseason camp. And look, when we're talking about this situation with heavy volume of carries, we could hop right over and go with Stanford, right? So, Austin Jones last year, heavy workload for the Cardinal. What are your questions going into the 2021 season with Stanford?
Yeah, similar scenario to Colorado. I want to see if Austin Jones gets as many touches as he did last year, because he was right up there, with the best in the nation in that category last year. A comparison that I came up with that some will find funny is that I consider Austin Jones the Bryant Koback of P5. I'm not a huge fan of Jones, and you just look back to last year. Even I know he put up big numbers from a fantasy standpoint, but with one of Stanford's better offensive lines that they've had in recent memory last year, he only averaged 4.4 yards per carry and only 2.67 yards after contact. So, just mediocre numbers from that standpoint, in my opinion. But if he still gets 25 touches a game like he did last year, then he's going to put up fantasy numbers, and ultimately that's really all we care about. But I want to see if they start to distribute carries, kind of look towards the future a little bit more. We've seen some coaching quotes indicate that, get EJ Smith and some others involved in that ground game. But then you kind of, even if they start to distribute carries a little bit more, maybe we see less passing attempts from Stanford this year, because they're instituting a new quarterback, new receivers. So, maybe that it doesn't ultimately matter if they distribute carries a little bit more.
I'm glad you went running back, because I think that's the obvious place to start. I agree with everything that you said. A lot of eyes on how much volume is Austin Jones going to get. See if maybe a player like EJ Smith gets worked into there. But for me, Mike, the other place that I'm looking at is Stanford and tight ends, right? Stanford is synonymous with producing some solid tight ends, and really that's where I'm going to be watching for things in this preseason camp. I'm a couple of best ball leagues this year. I've scooped up Benjamin Urasek, the tight end. I don't know if there's a lot of clarity at what's going on with tight end at Stanford, but if we have a breakout tight end and your league requires tight end, he's a player that I've been taking some late flyers on that you'll be able to get in your draft. He's been going undrafted or going at the very end. He's sort of my sleeper tight end this year. I always like to have an eye for Stanford at tight ends, and this year it's been really tough for you and I to get a good beat on that. We're going into preseason camp. I think we'll get a little more clarity out of camp. So for me, while I'm worried about the volume or want to see if Austin Jones can continue that, I think for me, if I'm going to go to a question B, it's like, man, who's going to be that Stanford go-to tight end this year? And that's sort of one of my sleeper picks right now, early on before camp starts up. What about Mike, let's go over to Utah, because I feel like, man, these running back questions keep going. We might as well keep the dominoes falling. Charlie Brewer transferring to Utah from Baylor. Is there a bigger, is there another question for you other than the running back spot at Utah? Because that's where it's at for me. I mean, you've got Chris Curry that came over from LSU, TJ Pleasure transferred over from Oklahoma, but yet everything we were reading in the spring, was Kyle Whittingham mentioning how Micah Bernard had all the tools it took to be a 3-down back in that offense. He's got speed, he's got power, he's got great hands out the backfield. I know Bernard is a player that if he hits, he's completely undervalued right now in fantasy draft, but if he doesn't, he's completely overvalued right now. He's a little bit of a risk and a gamble, but it seems like a lot of places, a lot of the things are in place for Micah Bernard to maybe emerge as the go-to back, which for me, sounds interesting. I know they lost Devin Brumfield to Tulane, and unfortunately they had the youngster last year that passed away. And so Chris Curry coming in, TJ Pledger coming in, are they coming in to play to back up, Micah Bernard? That's a tough. This is one of the tougher ones, I think, for me to decipher going into preseason camp.
Yeah, the same. I'm gonna go with the running back as well. Just because of the system and how often, a running back one under Whittingham and Andy Ludwig, their offensive coordinator, how often they top 200 carries in a season. Who that is, you lean towards Micah Bernard right now, but like you said, they brought in the pair of transfers. They brought in another transfer, Cincinnati guy, Tavion Thomas, who some like, I know, and as we saw with Ty Jordan last year. Whittingham's not he's not shy about even putting in a true freshman right in that backfield. So maybe one of those transfers. I mean, they haven't done anything since. That's why they've transferred. But maybe we see a Ricky Parks, their 3-star, who I know a lot are high on. Maybe he surprises in fall camp. So just because of past history and topping 200 carries in the season, I want to see who emerges from that group. Probably best to handcuff with one or even two other options aside from Bernard. And if you're looking for an underrated question for Utah, I'm not 100% sold that Charlie Brewer is going to be the starter this year. I know he had everybody was hyped up that he completed all 16 of his passes, but I think, Cam Rising was the starter coming out of camp last year, and I think he's healthy and can challenge Brewer for that starting job. So that's an underrated spot to look for Utah. Gotcha.
So I'm assuming most everyone believes that Charlie Brewer is going to be the starter in best ball leagues. What you're saying is if there's no in-season acquisitions, you may want to go ahead and go ahead and with the handcuff right there.
Correct. Yep.
That's fair enough. Let's go down to Arizona State, where there's not necessarily, there's questions surrounding the program. There's not necessarily any questions surrounding the running game and the quarterback. The questions for Arizona State for myself might be just how are they going to distribute the carries? This was something that you and I talked about a lot in the preseason. I anticipate Arizona State to remain a run-heavy offense. I'm expecting them to stay productive. I mean, Rachaad White's yards per carry average, can he keep that up? Maybe not, but man, even if he gets close to that, he's going to be very productive. You've got Chip Trayanum. He's going to be a very, productive 1B out of that backfield there, the bigger back, maybe more effective in the red zone. So if White doesn't break as many big ones as he did last year, maybe his value increases a little bit. And then you and I, something that I'm really of a strong opinion on is I believe, and it goes back to my Jahmyr Gibbs on believing that he's a Sunday player and maybe he's a little overvalued in fantasy. I feel like that at Jaden Daniels right now at the quarterback spot. I feel like he had a really solid year running the ball. He's a great decision maker in the air and on the ground now in that RPO offense. And I think his decision-making is going to have him on a roster playing on Sundays at some point. but I don't necessarily think it translates into elite or even above average college fantasy football production. So there's no questions for me for the Arizona State running game. It's just I want to see how it plays out and how they try to fit in Daniel Nagata, who is talented as well, how they fit him in there with Rashad White and Trip Trayanum already.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't have a lot of questions for them. Mine is more kind of geared towards the entirety of the offense. Offensive coordinator Zach Hill mentioned during the spring that they want to become more balanced, right? So they were 8th in run play percentage in the country last year at 64%. So, Zach Hill's, history back at, Boise State, they ran a very balanced offense, which it wasn't last year. I don't think they're going to get back to that because why mess up a good thing, right? They were dominant on the ground last year, Arizona State. They bring back, everybody in that backfield. They bring back 4 offensive line starters. So unless kind of, defenses adjust and stack the box, I think Arizona State should run the ball down their opponent's throats again this year. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if we get more quotes from Zach Hill that they want to become more balanced. I'm like you. I'm avoiding Jaden Daniels this year. I think he's a good option in 0 QB builds where you just kind of ignore the quarterback position until round 10 or later. And then you get, the one thing about Jaden Daniels, because of how good of a quarterback he is and his potential rushing upside is, he's going to get you 15 to 25 fantasy points every given week, right? He's not going to have those duds that some other quarterbacks in the country will have. So in 0 QB builds, I do like Daniels as an option, but just for how much Arizona State runs the ball, he's not a priority pick.
Yeah, I'm with you. Quintessential for me, low ceiling, high floor quarterback, safe option, right? Building late quarterback. He would then be the option as long as he's there on the board. What about another program? I have a feeling, Washington Huskies, Mike. Questions there abound. Where are your eyes and what position going into preseason camp here?
Yeah, running back 1. Just remembering back to when you and I were going over compiling projections for every team, I think running back 1 for Washington was easily our most difficult.
One of the worst. Yeah, one of the top ones at the list.
Yeah. I was just doing a little bit of research and I didn't realize this. The coaches, their nickname for their running back groups is the stable. The stable. So they already in that name, we know that they're going to use 3, 4, even 5 guys in that backfield. So if I was leaning towards somebody, it's probably Richard Newton, just because he's proven it in the past. He had double-digit touchdowns a couple of years ago. So he would be a guy that I believe in if there was a workhorse that would emerge, it's him. Sean Mcgrew is the starter right now, but he is, I believe 5'7". He's not a big guy, so he's not going to carry the load there if he remained the starter. So while I have my eyes on it, just they're going to distribute carries. So I don't think anybody's going to be a viable option in college fantasy, but I'm curious to see who comes out on top there.
So I'm with you. When you look at their stable, Mike, Sean Mcgrew, Richard Newton, Cameron Davis, Kamari Pleasant, right? That's just 4. I mean, we haven't even talked about any other guy that's not on that list yet. And so much like you mentioned, Mcgrew, I think, is the presumed starter, which is difficult for me to believe because of how productive Richard Newton has been when he's been healthy, particularly a couple of years ago before he got hurt. He looked like he was going to be, their next primary back. And then, the thing that's interesting too is, something I warn against is sometimes going against the grain or kind of taking with a grain of salt what some beat reporters have to say, because sometimes they get caught up in the fandom of the players too, and they sort of like one guy over another. What's interesting, Mike, if you kind of scour the web a little bit and get different notes from different guys that watch Washington practice, you'll have one guy that says how much Sean Mcgrew looks like the guy. And then the next guy is like, it's Richard Newton. It's got to be Richard Newton. And then there's momentum for Cameron Davis taking over eventually as the starter as well. So you're going to find a little bit of everything right there. And so I'm with you. My advice is that if you're going to take a chance on one Washington running back right now, for my money, it's probably Richard Newton. But really, at this particular point, you're probably better off staying away and finding value somewhere else. But I know, that's tough because some of these guys, they may play in a Big Ten, Pac-12 only league. And so you've got to take a stab with somebody. And so you and I right now would say, I think we're in agreement on that, Richard Newton, but it's definitely something we're going to have to keep our eyes during preseason camp. And who knows, like we mentioned on another show, this could be a situation where maybe a preseason camp injury factors into it as well. And then all of a sudden now you're down another man and there's more carries to be had.
They were 28th nationally in run play percentage at 58%. So I don't think that's going to change too much with Dylan Morris at quarterback. So I think they want to keep the ball out of the air and on the ground as much as possible still with him at quarterback. So, I mean, if it's a team that's running the ball that much, maybe somebody does pop and I think we're in agreement that Newton would be our guy.
So while we're talking about the run heavy teams, we went a little bit out of order here. So we'll go where we see a little bit more maybe of a 50-50. So before we start hopping over to the air raid teams, let's talk about Oregon real quick. Mike, what are your questions for the Ducks going into the 2021 season?
I want to know if Anthony Brown can run the Joe Moorhead offense effectively for the entirety of the season. Right now, I believe he's quarterback 59 in ADP. So you are getting him, essentially free at that point. And we know based on the past what Joe Moorhead quarterbacks have done and how often they're utilized on the ground. 131 carries over the last 7 years for the QB1 under Joe Moorhead. So, and Anthony Brown's a pretty good athlete. And we saw him, late last year come in for Tyler Shuck, and he was effective, especially running the ball in the red zone last year in those late appearances. So if he can hold that job for the entirety of the season and run that offense effectively, I think he's a great option, even as a priority backup that you can essentially get for free at this point.
Yeah, and I think for me, sticking along those lines, Mike, my question is just CJ Verdell going into preseason camp. Started off the year with 2 100-yard games last year, and then I believe it was a hand injury that sort of derailed his season a little bit. And when you talk about Joe Moorhead and his history, he also has a history of riding out backs too. And so you wonder what would have happened had CJ Verdell been healthy all year. And I think that was the big question going into last year, was whether or not Verdell was going to be able to take over as a lead one. And so the biggest question for me is at the running back spot, given Verdell's history, is it going to stay a rotation, or will we tend to see them lean on one back? The potential is there for Verdell, but history tells us that he's going to have trouble staying healthy. And usually I don't like those reoccurring themes of, that injury coming back, but I always think, what if Verdell stays healthy, and what if he's the running back one? You and I are seeing him being selected very late. You and I have him ranked, I think, somewhere in the 40s right now. And I would venture to say that in most drafts I have participated in, he's probably going off the board 50 plus. So he's probably going another round or two higher than where I have him. Lower than where I have him valued. But once again, I like talking about these teams because it gives me a chance to throw sleepers up there. And I feel, for me, another position I'm watching is tight end, which has been productive in that Moorhead offense last year. And I feel that Spencer Webb coming back this year has a chance to be a really good sleeper tight end pick in that Oregon offense this year. I've taken him in almost every best ball draft because I've gotten him basically for free at the end of every draft. So I just wanted to kind of throw those names out there and say that's where I'll be looking at. Let's head over to the air raid teams, Mike. Let's start with I guess it really doesn't start. You pick one, man. You want to go Washington State or USC? Because I feel like, we're going to probably be going to the same spot. Let's start with the Cougars. Let's start with Washington State. I have a feeling I know where we're going here, but there's also two options. So I'll let you go first, and I'll go option B, because I know there's got to be two questions in your head.
There's one question, in my opinion, not two, but I'll let you discuss that second one. Mine is who steps in for Renard Bell at wide receiver. We've updated the projections, we've updated the guide already with that news, and Joey Hobert, I believe is how you say it, is he was Bell's backup last year.
Yep.
And in the spring, and so he's our pick to step in for that wide receiver 2 role in the slot. I think I've beaten a dead horse, and many others have as well, with how we target the 2 slot positions in the run and shoot offense. So I'm curious to see how he performs in that role. There's other guys potentially involved there with Lincoln Victor, a Hawaii transfer. They had a JUCO transfer, Drake Owen, who I believe had 100 yards receiving in the first spring scrimmage there. So, but they, just based on what we were reading, they're the backups to Travell Harris. Now, how the coaching staff how they shuffle that around in fall camp, I'll be interested to see. Do they move one of those guys over to battle with Hobert for that new starting job? Do they move Calvin Jackson, a senior? Do they shift him into the slot because he's only 5'9", 5'10", I believe? He's been playing outside. Do they shift him into the slot to try and make up for that lost production? So I'll be focused on that wide receiver 2 spot there.
Yeah, I'm with you too. This is something you and I have talked about. I think initially my first thought was Lincoln Victor coming over, transfer from Hawaii. They just move him over, fill that role. But then you look at Hobert and, how highly he was thought of as a recruit coming in and what they think of him now. And I think naturally he's the player for that, to fill that void. I know you and I both project him in there. And I think for me, I'll probably just keep an eye on Lincoln Victor and just to see how they're working them into the rotation there, if it's in fact a 2-man race out of those 2 guys. But I feel pretty confident, much like yourself, that Hobert's going to be that other inside slot receiver. But questions for me is we have to keep our eyes on that quarterback spot. I don't care how much we feel that Jaden Delora has it nailed down. I still feel like we have to keep our eyes on it. And so I'm with you. I think Delora he's going to be the starter. That's what I feel, right? I just don't like Rolovich's history of yanking guys after they have a bad run, maybe a bad quarter, 2 picks in a matter of 2 quarters. And then next thing you know, Delora gets pulled and maybe we don't see him start the following week. That's the only thing I don't like about Rolovich. And the one thing that scares me off of Delora is that I'm worried about him, young quarterback, still getting experience, getting an early hook, and then we lose him for a week. And so that's what scares me off of Delora. But there's nothing not to like in regards to talent and his ability and the scheme in which he plays. So there's no question for me with Delora on being the starter. There's just a question on how solidified of a starter is he in that Rolovich air raid offense.
Well, just to add to that, I think it kind of works out too, just because while we both believe it's going to be Delora the starter, best practices would say you got to handcuff him, right? Most likely with Garantano. I mean, I know Cameron Cooper's not necessarily eliminated from that race, but we believe it would be Jaden Delora and Garantano. So best practices would say you're going to handcuff those guys anyways if you want to corral that Washington State room. And then it just works out if Rolovich decides to pull the quick hook on Delora, if he throws a few interceptions, because you have Garantano already on the roster.
Is Garantano any better though? I mean, let's be honest. I don't know, Mike. What might be, let's go with a question C here, a third question. Maybe we need to be keeping our eyes on who's the backup quarterback throughout preseason camp, maybe the quarterback 2 as well, because maybe if what I said comes to fruition, that other guy's going to get in there. And then the question is it Guarantano or is it Cooper? So there are some things to look at and keep our eyes on it at Washington State. And so We're going to end with the Trojans at USC, Mike. Doesn't seem to be any questions at quarterback. Doesn't seem to be any questions about wide receiver one. But after that, gets a little dicey now that they've lost what seems, now that they've lost Brew McCoy for what may be most of the season, if not all, because of his arrest. And I think it was a domestic dispute. So I'll be curious to see if anything resurfaces. But based on what you and I read, we feel pretty safe assuming that this is going to be a long-term deal. We'll see how it plays out. So I can only assume your question might be at the wide receiver spot, much like mine.
It is, but I also don't have I don't have a ton of question marks for that wide receiver 2 position, just because, every indication that we've read, it's going to be Taj Washington. Even though he's smaller-ish in stature, like, he played outside wide receiver last year at Memphis. So every indication is that he's going to step into McCoy's role. How does he perform in that role? We're not sure. I mean, it's a new system. I don't think he was there in the spring, so we're not entirely sure. We don't have any, practice reports to go on. But even in that system under Graham Harrell, wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 both have topped or been near 90 targets in every season that he's been there. So, aside from Drake London, there's usually 2 and 3 guys there that become viable college fantasy options. So just kind of the how that Brew McCoy news shakes up the whole wide receiver room is where I'll be focused at.
Yeah, I think looking back on it historically, Mike, in the 2 seasons that Harrell's been there at USC, I want to believe that this is accurate. And if not, it'll be pretty darn close. But I think 3 receivers have averaged at least 6 to 6.5 catches per game in that Graham Harrell offense. So that makes 3 receivers very viable. You had Katie Nixon, who transferred in from Colorado early on, who had to be feeling really damn good about himself. And then all of a sudden, Taj Washington transfers in, Jake Smith from Texas transfers in. But I'm with you. Washington seems to have the higher upside. I think he has the best potential in that offense. I think right now you and I are both seeing it. London, Washington, Gary Bryant. And then from there, it's probably, a couple of other those names that we mentioned, if not some of the younger guys, right? Like Ford, I think they got Jackson there as well. So there's no telling what happens in that offense, but you definitely want a piece of the top 3 in that offense. Now, if I'm going to go with a different question, just to throw it out there, is that Kedon Slovis has something to prove this year after playing really well as a freshman, being incredibly accurate. He struggled at times last year. And supposedly after the season, it was reported that it was a case of arm fatigue and that he's regrouped, he's ready to go. I don't know if I buy the arm fatigue stuff. Maybe it's legit, maybe it's not, but I do feel that Slovis regressed last year. And so I'm curious to see where he picks up this year and starts off, because that offense is no good without a quarterback that can really get the ball to the receivers accurately. And so, that's something else I think is worth watching in preseason camp, just to see how Slovis is how he's playing going into year 3 now. I just think that that's something that's worth watching, because I just question whether or not was it arm fatigue or was it not. So very long-winded there, but I do have some questions about Kedon Slovis. Any concerns there?
Not entirely. I'd like to see how he performs, this season. I think he'll probably be, similar to last year, in my opinion, now I'm getting long-winded and I don't, but I just don't see a ton of upside with him, just in terms of, I think based on,
he doesn't run the ball.
He doesn't run the ball, throwing. But you see that USC quarterbacks and under Graham Harrell are going to throw for 3,000 plus and 30 touchdowns. And even if, he was on pace to throw that last year with his, reported arm fatigue. So I think he'll be a solid QB2 for you regardless. But I wouldn't reach for him just because of his limited upside as a rusher.
Yeah, Mike, if I was to put a bow on the Pac-12, I think what I'm looking at after our notes here on the show is that I'm looking at programs like Arizona, UCLA, Utah, Cal, Oregon State, Washington, all programs that I have starred where the running back spots really are just kind of up for grabs right now. And so these are positions that we're going to be watching. There's a lot of running back value in the Pac-12 that's still to be determined whether or not it's in preseason camp or during the season. I think we're going to get some real value or find some value out of the running back spot in the Pac-12 in preseason camp. That's where our eyes are mostly going to be over the next couple of weeks. We're heading now into the second week. This is really the first week, full week of August. So we're going to get this up on the website for you guys. The college fantasy football drafts are heating up now. We're only weeks away from week 0. And then for what most leagues consider their first college fantasy football week 1 of the 2021 college football season. If you're watching these and enjoy them, go in there, support the site, become a member, All-American member, Heisman members, even get passes into our Discord server, which is approaching 350 members already. And we still have a few weeks to go. We're hoping to get that number above 400. Get in there and get your fantasy preseason draft guide. It gives you everything you need to know for your college fantasy football drafts. Mike, is there anything else that we need to add that I'm forgetting before we get out of here, man?
We're hitting the action next, so we're looking forward to talking about that.
That's it. Next ones we have coming up are MAC, Mountain West, and then we're going to follow that up with the SEC and then the Sun Belt. We should have everything up before the end of this weekend. Until the next show, my name is Joe DeSalvo. For my partner, Mike Bainbridge, we'll see you guys when we're talking MAC next. See ya.